Hello to the ASU GSB community and welcome to the EdTech ecosystem down under. Exploring the question, why is the Australian EdTech ecosystem so fertile? We've got a fantastic panel here today to discuss this topic and their various solutions and theses as to what's going on in Australia, not just post-COVID, but what is an ongoing trajectory of innovation and creativity. Just recently, this past week or so, a couple of weeks, an EdApp, a barely 2-year-old company in Australia that delivers a lot of online training and wants to be considered the mobile app of every household, was acquired by another tech unicorn in Australia, Safety Culture, for $40 million. They deliver to 90 countries, over 50,000 lessons a day. The latest EdTech census in Australia shows that the number of companies that have gone into the EdTech sector has doubled over a 12 to 18 month period, and the amount of funding coming to those companies also. About 40% of those companies have moved from startup to scale-up modes, and there's a high potentiality, not just for those companies within the market, which is obviously pretty small in Australia with a population of around 25 million, but is a huge doorway to many Asian countries. To survive in the Australian ecosystem, you really need a set of international customers, and Australians are uniquely positioned to go find those. So we've got I'm going to let the panel introduce themselves very briefly, and then we'll get into exploring that question. So, Dror, let's start with you.
Hi, I'm Dror. I'm Dror Ben-Naim. I'm founder and CEO of Smart Sparrow. Smart Sparrow is an adaptive learning platform that evolved over the years to be a general purpose courseware development platform. With a focus on personalized courseware. Late last year, we exited to Pearson, which are looking at using the technology in order to scale, hopefully, all their courseware into that capability, that technology. So I'm very excited to be here. I'm happy to talk about the topic.
Amanda.
Hi, I'm Amanda Bickerstaff. I'm an American in Australia, currently in quarantine in Brisbane. I am the CEO of Pivot Professional Learning. We're a data and insights company for schools that puts students at the center of the learning. So we provide pathways for students to get feedback directly from teachers on their teaching practice. We're in a different position than Dror. We are a small company that is starting to move into the scale-up phase and starting to expand outside of Australia.
Welcome, Adam.
Hi, everyone. My name is Adam Bremo. I'm the founder and CEO of Open Learning. Open Learning started off as a MOOC platform when we launched in 2012, and we've since grown into a global online education platform for everything from short courses through to full online degrees. We primarily operate in Australia and Southeast Asia, although we have about 2.5 million users around the world and about 116 higher education providers as partners. We listed on the Australian Stock Exchange in December last year. So we're probably one of the few Australian EdTech companies that's listed on the stock exchange locally.
Natasha is joining us from the government.
Very ominously said. Hi, everyone. I'm Natasha Monks. I'm the Americas Education Lead and the Trade Commissioner for Austrade. That's the Australian Trade and Investment Commission. So we're the Australian Government's Trade Promotion and Investment Attraction Agency, and we're responsible for supporting productive FDI into Australia. So we help Australian or international companies who wish to establish and build their business in Australia and understand the challenges of investing. So we seek to provide the information that's required to make good investment decisions and to provide a coordinated approach that saves investors time and money. Importantly too, we work closely with EduGrowth, who is Australia's education technology and innovation industry hub, and support Australian EdTech companies to grow faster in international markets. So happy to be here today.
Yeah, and a big shout out to David Linke, CEO of EduGrowth. And lastly, Nikki, and like many of our panel, Nikki is bicultural. She's in the US right now, but originally Australian. Nikki.
Yeah, thanks, Rose. My name is Nikki James, and I'm the Senior Research Fellow for Practera. Practera is an experiential learning company. We have an experiential learning platform that was designed to support industry-engaged learning, primarily in the higher education space, for internships, capstone projects, anything where you're bringing the industry into the classroom. But we're starting to also do a lot of work in work-based learning in the K-12 space, which is really exciting as well. So I'm based here in Boston, Massachusetts, but a proud Sydney-sider.
So let's dive in and work out, is the thesis actually true that the Australian EdTech scene is especially innovative? Dror, you've worked in Silicon Valley as well as in Australia and elsewhere in the world. What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's true. I think Australia has a particular edge when it comes to education. A few things. Education is the third biggest export. The industry is highly reliant on, well, not reliant in a negative way, but it's definitely an export industry. So that kind of puts a focus on trying to attract people to come to Australia. Australia doesn't have the Harvard and the Stanford and the MIT to attract, so it needs to attract on something else. And a lot of the things, the quality of teaching that it attracts on. Another thing that's interesting is that Australia mostly have, in the higher education space, big campus universities. So there's no community college, so to speak, and there's not a lot of regional liberal arts schools as there are in America, which actually makes the life of education entrepreneurs simpler. They have to sell to less schools. There's only 40 or so in the country, but they are big schools and they are typically well resourced, and the numbers of students are in the tens of thousands easily. And last, but what my experience is so I moved from, I started a company in Sydney, and 2014 I moved to Silicon Valley, and I grew up sales and marketing and operation in the US, and as well as learning design services as well. And my experience was that Australia was maybe 2-3 years ahead of the US market in terms of the ability of educators to innovate. And it's not that there were, less innovative people in the US. There was extremely innovative people everywhere. It's just that there were less hurdles of an educator or a faculty member wants to do something in Australia, because Australia had at that time already developed centralized budgeting and quality control systems around adoption of this technology. Whereas in America, when we were active in, trying to get into the market there, so 2015 and into 17 and 18, it was really early stages, and a lot of the conversation were like, you know what, maybe next semester I'll get some budget, or maybe next year we're going to do some project or so forth. So together that there's bigger campuses and there's budgeting for technology of our type, allowed us to basically arrive to 100%, market penetration in Australia. But it also means, it tells you something about the community here, which is more, I think, mindful of the fact that, that it's really important to innovate in the delivery of education. That's my short answer.
Yeah, no, I think there's other kinds of factors than just the simplicity of the go-to-market, right, which is generally caused by it being a smaller market, but some of the funding structures you mentioned. But Adam, you've talked about, you see that teaching and learning itself is more open to innovation.
Yeah, that's what we've experienced as well. And when we started the company, our big idea at Open Learning was we wanted to make it possible to design courses that were more socially constructive. So there's a very strong focus on sort of learning sciences research, the learning experience, the role that learning design plays. And we found that in Australia, there's actually a lot of interest in those approaches. And, in some ways, as Dror said, it's partly because what attracts people to Australian institutions is the quality of learning and teaching. And they're quite mindful that they need to keep improving that. And when we looked sort of around the world when we were starting the company, I spent a little bit of time in Silicon Valley as well, and we spent a lot of time in Southeast Asia. We found that Australia actually, although sometimes we feel it's slow when we're on the ground, when you look globally, you realize that actually Australian institutions are very open to trying out new things. And particularly, I think with learning design, Australian institutions have really built up very large learning design teams much faster than most other institutions in the world. And they're driving some of that educational innovation as well.
But yet they're open to partner platforms. They're not just sort of job preserving as well, right? So
yeah, exactly. They're always looking, yeah.
Right, to seek something out. What about K-12, Amanda? I mean, how do you see that there are environmental factors that make that sector also innovative? And do we see some of the resistance around educators to technology, COVID aside, obviously, or is there more openness to EdTech innovation in that group?
It's a great question. As an educator from the US that is now here, it's given me a unique perspective. And I think there are three main differences that allow for more innovation to happen here. One is that in the US, about 10% of students go to private schools, but in Australia, it's about 30%. And so it's a really large number, and enrollments and competition for students is very high. Funding is by pupil. And so everyone is trying to have a better system, to have more technology, to do more innovative things. So that's number one. Number two is that there's really a big focus on one-to-one devices and technology-enabled communities. After the financial crisis in 2008, there was an initiative to put a device in every hand of a student. 3 years later, where those devices went, we don't know, probably in someone's bag. But it really created a groundswell where, when you look at a big urban area in the US, let's say New York City, most types of surveys or other types of work have to be done by pen and pencil and scanned, and it takes a long time. Whereas here is that there's a really strong access to technology, and that allows these great platforms to exist within that school. And the third thing, and I think this is a really important point, is that a big distinction from the US and Australia is that principals here have all been teachers. And they have moved up, they've been in schools for 20, 25 years. And that is such an enormously important component of thinking about teaching and learning as a core function of being a principal. Most principals that work in small schools still teach. And so there's a real connection to the work that's being done. For example, we have surveys about students, and a principal actually has a class to survey their own students. They get that experience of how it works or doesn't, to be able to identify what is meaningful and worth their teacher's time. And so I think that, there's a lot of really great things here that allow for EdTech to sink when it's done well.
So Nikki, you came to the US partly to help continue to partner with Northeastern University, which obviously we all know is one of the real innovators in terms of higher ed to work pathways and really innovative pedagogy at the university level. What attracted Northeastern as an investor in Practera and the use of the platform pretty widely in the university?
Yeah, I think we met Northeastern for the first time probably about 2 years ago now, or 2.5 years ago now, in my first trip out here to work with Boston University, who's also in Massachusetts. I met the Northeastern team along the way. And I think that our pedagogy of the platform and the pedagogy that the platform was designed around very much aligned with, I guess, the approach that Northeastern takes to university. Northeastern traditionally was a blue-collar institution, and the co-op model came out of a need for the students to earn money while they were learning. And now it's evolved into this really, robust part of their ecosystem. But one of the things that they realized is that was accessible, that co-op model was accessible for their traditional students, but they had a whole bunch of, non-traditional students, degree completers and things like that didn't have the capacity to take, 6 months off their work and study and do a co-op. So they were looking for alternative solutions to get the same advantages for those students. And Practera enabling that in a virtual environment and supporting that really complex learning pedagogy enabled them to achieve that goal. And so they were really interested in not just like what we could do for them, but also how we could partner together to serve other institutions and the corporate market as well.
And so the goal really is to connect an undergraduate or a graduate with truly a work context for them to be combining study and learning and contextual application, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, one of the terms we've been using at the moment is like learning in the flow of work. So, being able to learn and work and have those two things truly integrated. So, whether that be being in a corporate setting and needing to upskill, or if it's being in a higher ed institution and wanting to get those real soft skills and professional skills that you need for success in that work environment. And also just the opportunity to be able to check out a whole bunch of different careers. I think that definitely opens up access for a lot of students because they can see themselves in those professions by having an experience engaging with somebody who is in those professions. And I think that's really important for career exploration and opening up their eyes to what's possible.
And making different choices as they're learning. So very much like the US direction, I think it's around 40% of Australia's 600 EdTech companies are in the corporate learning in the flow of work, upskilling and reskilling area. And obviously that is important in every developed economy as we see the shifts caused by, well, now Corona, but obviously automation and other kinds of demographic and environmental shifts. Australia's unique, though, in that there is a high satisfaction amongst employers of the innovative nature of graduates. I think all of us who've spent time in the US know that every chamber of commerce, every survey, is all about the dissatisfaction that employers have on the whole with the skills that graduates bring post a 4-year, incredibly expensive 4-year degree. I think that Natasha, help us here, but I think it's something like 83% of companies, and it's quite a large sample in Australia, are excited about the innovative nature of the graduates they have in coming to them. Why is that, and what is it about the connection between universities in Australia and the workforce that means there's this high employability?
Yeah, so employability or work integrated learning, it cuts across the sectors. So it's higher education, but also in the vocational education and training sector as well. So Australian courses are structured to help students make that successful transition to a career. Course content is informed by industry practice, practical development of students' communication and networking skills, and a focus on entrepreneurial thinking as well. So education providers and Australian government at both the national and the state level are supporting many programs, activities designed to foster relationships between students, mentors and industry leaders. These help students to develop contacts, networks, and they're all beneficial to their careers as well. So things like on-campus incubators, careers fairs, digital platforms, mentoring, they've all been standard practice for years now. So higher education providers are embedding employability skills with their formal qualifications. So, for example, by engaging industry in curricular and assessment, other approaches include co- and extracurricular activities such as virtual teamwork, structured business analyses, industry engagement, it goes on. And so we see the likes of Practera, for example, who deeply understand this space and harness that to provide a great experience through their adaptive platforms in new and interesting ways too. Australia's very vocational educating system is industry designed, industry led, it's benchmarked globally and recognised by the OECD, UNESCO and ILO for its strengths in connecting the skills that are being taught with employment outcomes that are actually needed as well. So all vocational and education trainers and assessors are required to have current first-hand experience within the industry that they teach. That's quite unique, actually.
Yeah, and are you talking about the TAFE system primarily there?
The TAFE system, precisely, and RTO, yeah, TAFEs and RTOs as well, registered training organisations. So they work closely with industry leaders to develop and review the course content. So it's always at the forefront of industry practice. Now, talking about survey and stats and facts and figures, the Australian government runs the survey that you just mentioned. It's an annual employer satisfaction survey to give education providers information that they can use to constantly refine the courses. That means that the graduates gain the skills that are valued by employers as well. It's called QUILT, the Quality Indicators in Learning and Teaching and Learning. And it's a survey that reports the views of the employers about the attributes of the recent graduates from Australian higher education institutes. So in 2019, the survey that it was actually 84%, not 83%, that was that were rated as by their direct supervisors as being satisfied. And on top of that, 86% of the graduates from Australian universities were employed within 4 months of graduation too. Other rankings include the 2019 QS Graduate Employability Rankings. 8 Australian universities feature in the top 100, 4 in the top 20, top 50, 2 in the top 10. And then in addition to that, you've got 5 Australian universities appearing in the top 100 of the Global University Employability Rankings for 2019 by the Times Higher Education. So we do punch above our weight. You know, we are we're a small nation. And because in Australia, employability is not in addition to a formal qualification. It's a core component of the overall study experience. And that is what is most significant.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's interesting that you've talked about and Adam's talked about before is that there is this close relationship between universities and industry in a way that is very open. It's not a corrupt one, but it seems to be highly beneficial. I think, Adam, you mentioned that when we first spoke, that your co-founders came out of university relationships, and Dror, your whole product came from a PhD. And I know Which, is it Vico, several other companies have been really incubated inside a university, which is more unusual, right? Rather than the sort of classic VC-funded incubators. So, Adam, talk a little bit about that and why you think that's happening, and Dror, jump in.
Yeah, I think it's quite interesting. Actually, I think 3 of us here have quite a close link to UNSW. Sort of, Dror and I used to be on the same floor of a building, desks on the same floor of a building in UNSW. So, so I started Open Learning with a former classmate and I guess a former professor, one of my former professors from my undergraduate years at UNSW. And, I think one of the key things that we found, and I think all of us have probably found, is that in order to get anywhere in EdTech in Australia, you have to actually have a pretty solid foundation to what you're doing. I think the idea that you sort of, do like a hackathon on a weekend and come up with an idea and then all of a sudden, the education system adopts it, I think that doesn't happen. In order to get somewhere, you really have to show that there's research behind what you're doing, that you've actually proven it works at a university or an institution in Australia. You've got the evidence that it works. It's been reviewed by somebody. And that takes years. But once you do it, then I think you find that you will get adoption. So I think there is an openness to try things out to some extent. But I think that extends to a pilot where you can prove yourself. If you can't prove yourself, then you won't get much further than that. But in terms of the, sort of industry, so to speak, yes, there's a lot of openness working with I think, separate companies and providers to some extent. I think internally in Australia, it's not all rosy in terms of, employability ratings and things like that. There's a significant debate going on in Australia at the moment about what the purpose of the higher education system is. And many people would say that it is to get people jobs. And it's a real debate as to whether that is the true purpose of a university. And I think it's probably also the case that in Australia, there is this expectation that that is what many of the universities are for. Whereas I think in other countries, there is additional expectations placed on the universities. And Australian universities have been very good at navigating this landscape and delivering on sort of all of the outcomes at once, but that's coming under pressure at the moment. But there is openness, there is a lot of innovation, and Australian universities, I think, surprise you in how quickly they can adapt to some of these changes,
right?
Despite their size.
I think the adoption and adaptation aspects are high qualities of sort of the ecosystem, right? As a country of consumers, Australia's always been a very forward-looking set of early adopters. Sometimes that transitions to institutions and sometimes it doesn't, but here it does. Dror, anything to add?
I echo Adam's points. I did feel that having come, and it's a luxury that that happens. I don't recommend any entrepreneur to go and do first a PhD in the topic.
It's a long path. Yes.
It's a small 5-year delay. But having had the benefit of incubating as a research group in a university and spinning off a company, and we were, I think, one of the early companies that did that in EdTech, definitely in Australia, that did give us competitive advantage because we were able to speak the language and kind of cross the chasm of distrust that happened between a faculty member or anyone whose job is in education has when they speak to someone who's trying to sell them something. And once we were able to basically quickly position ourselves like, look, we were a research group, researchers just like you, and let us show you the data, let us talk to you, let's use a reference to a professor that that really helped us. To what extent that's an Australian advantage versus anything else, I don't know. I would say that I do think higher education is definitely a herd type market, meaning that people like to follow the lead. And so, if you were spun out of Harvard and MIT or the like, then, people would take you seriously. We didn't have that luxury, but we did spun out of a university, what they called Group of 8, a G8 university here in Australia. And that gave us some sort of gravity. It wasn't. So it also didn't give us any gravity in America. So we had to prove ourselves again once we walked in and tried to broach trust into the US market. And we were lucky because we had a really good academic relationship with Arizona State University that started when we were still a research group. So we leveraged that.
Right. Right, Nikki and Wes are living that reality now too. Amanda, let's turn a little to K-12. I think Pivot Professional Learning's had a unique role over the COVID learn from home phase of the last 6 months, which has looked pretty different in Australia than it did in the US. What are some of the insights that you learned from how teachers made that pivot in primary and secondary schools in Australia?
That's a great question. So Australia is in a unique position where every single student in Australia was in home learning for at least 2 weeks this year. We went from 20,000 home learners to over 3 million. And so it was very, very quick. There was a huge shift. And so what we did is we thought we were going to launch. So I love that we have researchers here. We thought we would launch this small survey in April. Just, I wrote it with some help. It's 44 questions. No one's going to answer it. And we ended up getting over almost 4,000 responses, about 1% of Australian teachers and 2.5% from New Zealand. And it was pretty fascinating because it was only over a 4-day period. And everyone at that time was either preparing to go to online learning or had gone. And, I think that what we found that's unique to this conversation is that Australia has an incredibly fragmented EdTech market. And so we asked quite a few questions around education technology, because at this point, with the access issues, there's a lot of inequitous, things that happened in Australia. 1 out of 10 students in New South Wales never did anything but pen and paper over their first term at home. But what we did find is that on average, schools are using between 2 and 5 technologies to do online learning. And we're all EdTech people here. And I know we all have about 50 features and things you need to learn and onboarding processes. And most of these technologies have only been used for less than a year. And so there was this extreme pastiche or cobbling together of tools to try to replicate the physical classroom. And what we found through a lot of quantitative and qualitative data is that there was no replacement to the physical classroom. So that's one. The second thing that was really interesting is that in the K-12 market, something to consider if you're deciding to come over here is that it's a very regional market, meaning that there's a lot of competition and let's say attitude around who knows what's best for students. So you'll see this is something very different. So when we looked at New Zealand, 70% of schools use Google Classroom as their primary tool. Okay, so pretty big. You looked at Australia, the top 5 tools were less than 50%, and they were different based on every region. And it really just kind of shows that here in Australia, it's not a national education system outside the national curriculum and some other funding pieces. It's really a regional system. That means that you could be really well entrenched in one market and it'd be almost as difficult, Dror, as going off and trying to get into another country. Like if we're going to go from Victoria to Queensland, which I'm doing right now, it's a whole new game. We have to build that same amount of reputation. And I think we see that in the research and how it had filtered down where, teachers were being tasked to use multiple technologies to try to reach students with only a week's notice in some cases. So we thought that was really interesting. And just one last thing is that, we talk about regionality and we're in this opportunity to actually work with the newly formed coalition of principals in Australia. So this is kind of groundbreaking because the sectors don't play particularly well together. So we have Catholics, we have independents, and we have your government schools. And so what's happened is now this coalition of principals have come together across all of the sectors, including working with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students, to develop a principal survey that we're doing with them to try to get to the cross-sectoral issues and impact of COVID-19 on what it means to be a principal in this time. So that's an exciting outcome. We have a lot that's happened, but to see that there's this collaboration that could happen like never before at that top level is pretty exciting to be a part of.
Yeah, that's interesting. And it's rare for the sectors to work together like that, to be able to provide, true ecosystem improvement, right, for everyone. As you say, the dominant nature of independent and private schools in the K-12 space in Australia is pretty unique. So other thoughts about Australia's proximity to a lot of different Asian countries. We always talk about China, obviously, although not so much lately in Australia. There's so many other markets that are important, and I think it's worth kind of discussing how they may have affected your business. Adam, you want to talk about that first?
Yeah, sure. So Australia, obviously, it's very far from many places in the world, but luckily, it's the closest place it is to is Southeast Asia, and the relationship between, I think, Australia and many of the Southeast Asian countries is very strong, and a lot of that, I think, comes from the success of Australia's universities in the international student market, where so many people across Southeast Asia and all of Asia, many other countries now, actually studied in Australia, and they had a really good experience. And because of that, there's a very strong affinity towards Australian education. On top of that, the Australian government for a long time had a program called the Colombo Plan, which really sponsored people to come to Australia for study. And now there's a new Colombo Plan, which sends people from Australia to study in Southeast Asia. They're going the other direction. And beyond that, there's tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of people traveling. But I think that's what that's done is it's really entrenched the Australian education in the region, and to the point where a number of countries in Southeast Asia have built their qualifications frameworks off of the Australian qualifications framework. So you get this much better understanding both ways of how the education systems work, and that knowledge exchange has been really important. So for us, we actually expanded into Malaysia initially about 6 years ago. And now we're the largest platform for higher education providers in the country. And that's been a very interesting, exciting experience. But it also means that we have to look at each country completely differently. And the same challenges, Amanda has, between the States and Australia, you have that between states and these countries as well. So you're going into a new country, you can't really just think of it as the entire region. You have to think of, okay, there's a lot of countries in the region. Which ones are my product or solution going to be most applicable to? What are the links between the education systems? What are the networks between the universities or the school systems? And I guess in the schools, there's a large network of Australian international schools, for example, across Southeast Asia as well. So yeah, I think we've got this really good advantage in terms of proximity, which seems a bit odd because it's still like a 10-hour, 9-hour flight when you can fly. But the time zones are very similar, which is great for us. And there's a strong cultural affinity between the two regions.
Right, and that constant exchange in regular times, right? Between people moving back and forward. What other factors do you think are something that either new investors or companies coming into either the Australasian area should be thinking about?
Well, when you're thinking about it, maybe I'll take that one. When you're thinking about Australia's education system, the international education system itself and how it's worked, beyond students coming to study in Australia, the proposition of study with Australia has really been at the foundation of it. And so we're just trying to sort of bring that more into the narrative now, because transnational education and borderless has really been a core part of Australia's international education story as well. So, talking about Southeast Asia, South Asia, Northeast Asia, they really all sit within our top 20 markets for source students coming here to study. And so they'll return home as alumni, telling the story of affinity to Australia as well. But in addition to that, there really is the brand of Australian education, so campuses that are offshore, for example, West Australian certificates of education and curriculum that follows under that, the Victorian certificate of education and the curriculum that sits underneath that. So as Adam said, there is a lot of familiarity already for the sector with Australia and its system.
How's that being affected by COVID though? I mean, I'm teaching a course at Harvard this year, and we've got every student in a different time zone, and nobody's actually here. Now, people are still paying, there's still revenue, but that's partly because of the Harvard brand. What does it really mean for all of the economy and also Australia's reputation? And is it possible to deliver this borderless education during COVID?
Yeah, it's been a tough year. 2020 has been a tough year. We had bushfires initially, as you'd remember. That feels like a lifetime ago now. And then obviously COVID hit, and so the canary in the coal mine, I guess you could say, was China in all of that, when our borders first closed to China among other nations, and that's our largest source market. So we're still in the borders at the moment. There's no mobility of students at the moment. They are looking at options around pilots to bring cohorts of students back into Australia to continue their higher education courses. So we see some movement in there, but obviously these take time to evolve. They're complex issues. They're ongoing issues more broadly in the world. So, but meanwhile, we are looking at our online delivery of courses for higher education as well, with a pathway to face-to-face when that's possible. And so whether that's through platforms, innovative platforms, social learning platforms such as Open Learning, or directly through the universities as well, I think they're really important ways for students to still experience what it means to get an Australian education, because while we know that experience is important, there are other ways to experience the quality of Australian education too. So having these technology platforms is critical to the story.
Can I just add something to what Natasha was saying? I think the ability, I guess the innovative ecosystem in Australia actually helped with that situation. So when Australia closed its borders to China, the institutions and a lot of the EdTech companies actually worked together to solve that problem, to transfer learning online, to kind of do really fast iterations of their technologies to make sure they were accessible in all those countries. I mean, a specific example for us is we had an in-person experiential experience, a work integrated learning experience planned for a whole bunch of international students all around the country. All of a sudden, a lot of those students weren't able to get into Australia. So we had to pivot really quickly and transfer it into a virtual program, plan for all the industry partners to be prepared to deal with and work with students overseas. And that was able to happen in a really short period of time because the government, the higher education institutions, and us as a technology provider were working collaboratively to solve the problem. And I think if we didn't already have this innovative collaborative environment, that would have never been a reality. And I'm sure Adam and Dror have stories of like late nights and early mornings hustling to make things work for their customers as well, so that they could support their students that weren't able to get in. So yeah.
From the K-12 perspective, it's pretty interesting because when you talk about a large independent sector, a lot of that revenue actually comes from borders. So students that are international. So we often think of international students and revenue being for universities, but it actually impacts the financial sustainability across the system. And so many schools are going to be, when you talk about Rose, what to think about if you decide to come here, is that budgets are most likely going to shrink significantly in K-12 next year around certain types of pieces. And so especially in that independent and Catholic sector, because their financial sustainability is so predicated on their ability to get overseas students. And so 20 to 30% sometimes, and then that border kind of program where they even get more revenue. And so I think it's going to be quite interesting to see how the system reorients or reacclimates next year when there's not going to be as many people that can pay we have 9% unemployment here. People are, education is an incredibly important investment that most families make. But it's going to be a much different situation where those dollars are going to be less and people are going to have to start making difficult decisions. And where that, when you think about proxies, an independent school is a proxy for a high income school. A Catholic is a proxy for a middle income, and a government is a proxy for a low income. And what we're going to see is that enrollments are going to shift, and there's going to be a real, I think it's going to be quite interesting to see the impact over the next couple of years in the K-12 space here.
And there's going to be more opportunity probably for scale and necessity. Any last thoughts as we round the corner in terms of helping people understand what the value is and what the opportunity is in Australia?
I would say that because Australia is a relatively small market, a lot of entrepreneurs that have a global mindset from the get-go, and they think, and the fact that it's an English-speaking language, a country, that means naturally people would think about marketing their products to the US. So maybe that's worth noting. And the other thing that was, at least for us, was really useful in our kind of rapid expansion within the country was that in the US there's way more, publishers, sales reps, like thousands more. And in Australia, there's just absolute numbers are really low. I would say less than 100. So that's just like there's less competitive pressure, and you're not the 10th person who's reached out to talk to a professor that week, trying to sell them something, and that actually helps. So it was kind of good to be in a way in a less hyper competitive environment, obviously. Right. So if you couple that with the structural difference of state-owned big campus universities, which were thinking about their innovation as a competitive edge, and therefore budgeted for it. That's the reason why we felt that the Australian market was a little bit ahead of where the US market was at the time.
Yeah. I think a number of things you brought up around infrastructure, around teaching and learning, innovation. And also the connection between school and college and government initiatives as well, as some of the contributors. Yeah. I want to thank you all, Nikki, Dror, Adam, and Amanda, and Natasha. Thanks for bringing your expertise. And I hope folks listening know they can reach out to you and learn a little bit more about either your roles, companies, or the many, many other 595 companies that we didn't get to mention who are doing fantastic work in Australia. Be well and be safe, and we look forward to all meeting again when we can truly be global and local. Thank you.